I'm joined in studio by international affairs analyst Dan Perry, former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, as well as former chairman for the Foreign Press Association in Jerusalem. Dan, thanks so much for being here. As we heard from Hagari, just the ongoing hostage situation as IDF troops are deep inside Gaza. The hostage dilemma remains one of the most complicated when it comes to the war efforts, but we're seeing international pressure. We're hearing about hostage negotiations between Qatar and the United States having a heavy hand really pressuring Qatar for some of these negotiations. What can you tell us?
Well, it's a terrible dilemma, of course, because what is the price of one hostage? I mean, should Israel stop the war effort for 3 years to save a single hostage? Obviously, you'd say no, but then tell to the family of that hostage. So currently, they're talking about, I believe, a number of about 50. Israel insists on certain criteria that children and mothers that all of them be released and that families not be separated. And we shall see what ultimately the deal is. I think in Israeli public opinion, there is not inconsiderable pressure on the government to insist on a release of all the hostages in exchange for anything at all. And there is a willingness to pay a tremendous price. For example, even including all the Hamas prisoners in the hands of Israel.
We continue to see just this increased activity on the northern front. Israel continuing to threaten Hezbollah and Lebanon, therefore saying don't get more involved, saying that we will, in their words, even turn Beirut into Gaza if they need to with their military activity. But all of this as the United States is also pressuring Israel not to do that.
The United States is also threatening implicitly on its own by having 2 carrier groups just off the coast of Lebanon, more or less. It is really unbelievable. Hezbollah evidently wants to get credit for helping Hamas a little bit without paying the price, I suppose. It doesn't seem they're eager for a full-blown war, else they would have instigated it. I am amazed, frankly, that Israel tolerates this. And as some viewers will know who've seen me before, I'm very far from a warmonger. I'm a person of moderation. I prefer partition of the Holy Land and a peace process and compromise. But realistically, Hezbollah firing rockets at Israel on a day like today when there's this whole other front in the south and Israel is supposed to accept this somehow. Israel, for the past years, has been put in a position of really normalizing the abnormal and accepting the unacceptable. The Houthis are firing rockets at Israel from Yemen. I have to say, if Israel decides to put its foot down, I want to see the world complain, honestly. I don't know what else can be said when tens of thousands of people have been forced to evacuate the north while these criminal lunatics and across the border fire rockets. It's insane.
And as this happens, you do continue to see all of this international pressure to limit this from expanding into a regional war.
I think, Nicole, the pressure is to avoid civilian casualties. And this is the thing that I think Israel doesn't do well enough to explain what it's doing, why people are dying, who is dying, what efforts they're making. Israel just assumes that people are not going to accept its explanations, and I think that's a mistake. Israel does have, I think, carte blanche to destroy Hamas and Hezbollah. But it has very, very little leash to do this at the cost of mass killings of civilians.
In exchange, we read, this is not corroborated, for prisoners who are also held within the state of Israel. Now, this is to release women and children on both sides, non-combatants, innocents. And this, I believe, is one component of what will achieve a break in hostilities.
Now, seeing some of these Arab partners step up and condemn Hamas, how significant is this when it comes to Israel's continued war efforts?
It would be very significant if states like Qatar made the case more profoundly and basically made it clear that Hamas from this point henceforth is no longer in any way supported by them, and they will not deliver any money to Gaza that is in any way going to end up in the hands of Hamas, and to condemn them unequivocally. And frankly, I haven't heard that. I haven't heard it even from Bahrain. They toy with it. They say it's important to release the hostages, but I heard essentially false equivalence between the hostages in Gaza that include Holocaust survivors and babies of under a year with accused terrorists in the hands of Israel, the prisoners. And that equivalence is preposterous. And to hear that coming from Bahrain, which is very far from a democracy, is, again, laughable.
You really cannot compare the two. It's a great point you bring up, Dan. Now, Dan Perry, I want to talk to you about something interesting that we continue to see abroad right now. We heard from Defense Minister Yoav Gallant in a meeting with French Defense Minister today, and he compared the Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar to Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden right now is a person who is being glorified on different social media by these younger Western liberal college students mainly. How can we explain exactly what's happening with the glorification of Osama bin Laden, and then how does it tie into if someone like Gallant is going to compare Sinwar to bin Laden?
Comparing Sinwar to bin Laden is part and parcel of Israel's message, which I believe is correct, that Hamas is not only an enemy of Israel, and not only an enemy of the Palestinians, in as much as Hamas oppresses its own people in Gaza, and is currently reveling in their own death at the hands of Israel, but it is part of the global jihadi movement that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were, and that Islamic State, Daesh, ISIS was, and therefore is the enemy of all Western civilization, indeed, all civilization. I think that is a message that, to a certain degree, resonates, and I believe it to be true. As for the youth in America, there is a very particular, specific issue with Gen Z, age 18 to 24. It does not stop with nonsensical views about Israel or ignorance about the fact that the gender non-binary supporters of Hamas would be strung from the rafters in Gaza. It's not just that they don't know that. It's not just that their views on Israel border on the anti-Semitic at times. But polls show that they don't much support capitalism, liberalism, or democracy. There is a particular issue with Gen Z, whose brains have been scrambled by social media and by Russian bots. And I fear that, perhaps like Gaza itself, the issue is too big for Israel alone to handle.
So do you believe that it poses any real threat to Israel when we're talking about the international general perception of what's happening on the war, especially, might I add, as the war efforts continue, we see that Israel continues to lose the popularity when it comes to the war?
I'm not convinced about that. The world has over 1 billion Muslims. That is the reason why in social media, Israel can't compete. If the entire American population were tweeting for Israel, it still would look like Israel's losing the social media war. If you look at polls in the US, 70 to 80% support Israel in this war. Okay, the issue specifically is the youth and Gen Z, and that will indeed be a problem in 20 years when they're in power.
It's not just the younger generation, though. We unfortunately are seeing many Western media outlets, let's say BBC, for example, that continues to also side with Palestinians. So we're seeing it broadcast on these supposed to be trustworthy media sources, really broadcasting an agenda, it seems.
I think the BBC would deny that they side with the Palestinians. But sure, Israel has a legitimate quibble with much of the international coverage. Look, television, other than I24, is oftentimes a rather superficial medium that is about horse races and death tolls and not much more than that. So on October 7th, they appeared to side with Israel. And ever since, they appear to side with the Palestinians. It isn't as bad as Israelis sometimes feel, honestly. It's just superficial. If you look at editorial boards in the US, if you look at serious commentators in the US, if you look at serious hosts of television shows in the US and in Britain, I don't think any of them support Hamas, and I think most of them are even-handed between Israel and the Palestinians. And look, you can't divorce what's going on now from the greater context. In the greater context, the current government of Israel is a far-right government that whose policies are not supported by the world. I'm not saying that is the reason for October 7th. I'm saying that is the reason why it's hard for people to side too much with Israel when the prime minister is Netanyahu and when the minister in charge of the West Bank is Smotrich. It's difficult. And you know what? There is a sense in Israel that everything changed on October 7th, and what was before cannot again be. But one thing that will be is that the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, has 15 million people, roughly equally divided between Jews and Arabs. And the idea of an ultimate partition remains the only solution I can see to avoid a binational, non-Jewish state. And that will remain. And that will remain a discourse in the world after this war is over. And currently, it's not friendly to Israel.
It's the day after the war is certainly a question that is on everyone's mind. But for now, we're focusing on exactly the war at hand and the latest updates. International affairs analyst Dan Perry, thank you for providing your insight into exactly what's happening here on the ground, day 42 of the war here in Israel. Thank you.
My pleasure.